The period of Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877 was characterized by attempts to revitalize the Union, the struggle of blacks to become integrated into antebellum society, and political disunity within the Republican Party.
While watching this video, two questions to keep in mind are, to what extent did the 14th and 15th Amendment affect society, as well as what were the legacies of the era of Reconstruction and what did it establish?
The Reconstruction era had two main goals. The first one was to determine how much freedom should be given to freed blacks, and the second was to reincorporate the southern states into the country. Between the years of 1865 and 1867, President Johnson, who was a Southerner and a former slave owner, came up with a plan to balance black rights and the Home Rule. White Southerners eventually gained control of southern states and denied black Southerners their political rights by using violence. White Southerners and the Ghosts of the Confederacy. After the Civil War, many white Southerners and political leaders refused to accept their loss in the Civil War. The pro-white Southerners, in the wake of losing the war, created the ideology that God spared the South for a greater purpose. This ideology was known as the Lost Cause. The Lost Cause was the phase that the South applied to the Civil War defeat. They viewed the war as a noble cause, but only as a temporary setback in the South's ultimate vindication. The Lost Cause promoted white supremacy. Southerners supported and pushed for white supremacy. The Lost Cause was a product of Confederate defeat and represented the post-war phase of the South as compared to the North, which was doing better economically and socially. The South demanded rationalization, remembrance, and redemption.
After the Civil War, African Americans wanted to achieve two main objectives. First was they wanted to be free of white supervision and just be able to live their life freely. They didn't want complete social equality, but however they did desire land, voting and civil rights, and to receive an education. Field number 15 was issued by General Sherman and gave grants of land up to 40 acres. Rumors about federal government giving 40 acres and a mule never came to pass. And in fact, the federal government never intended for an actual land redistribution program to former slaves. In 1865, Congress issued the Freedmen's Bureau, which provided social, economic, and educational aid, as well as protection and advice to former slaves and poverty-stricken whites. This was the first social welfare program instituted by Congress and was supported by Republicans within the government as well as African Americans nationwide who wanted to have a suitable aid for them to carry out life in society as they had just come out of slavery. Henry McNeill Turner was one of the most influential American Methodist Episcopal ministers there was at the time. He evangelized many former slaves and entered Georgia politics while serving as a key speaker and leader for the African American community. Before the Civil War, literacy rates in the South were quite staggering. More than 70% of whites were literate compared to the only 10% of blacks. However, after the war, African American literacy rates rose to greater than 30% within a decade. Migration to cities. African Americans wanted to migrate to cities in order to find family, seek work, escape from farm life, and they also wanted more freedom to move about, and it offered them a greater sense of independence. Effects of these were an increase in African American population in cities, as well as white disapproval because it gave blacks greater opportunities, and they felt that the farm could better restrict them from going to move up in the social ladder. In regards to religion, the church was the absolute center of African American life. They could experience self-government, leadership positions, and as well as turn their churches into educational institutions like Bible schools for their African American communities. They also gave birth to other organizations such as trade unions and drama clubs, which fosters a better sense of unity and community for the African American.
The 14th Amendment was passed in June 1866, and it made every citizen equal before the law, thus outlawing the black codes and keeping states from violating their citizens' civil rights. Both radical Republicans and women were upset. The Republicans because the amendment didn't give blacks the direct power to vote, and the women because they weren't receiving legislation on their behalf. Congress passed the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in February 1869. This guaranteed the right of all American males to vote regardless of their race. The 15th Amendment angered abolitionist suffragettes because they believed it created an aristocracy of sex. In 1865, the new Southern state legislatures decided to come up with new and revised black codes. These black codes allowed local officials to arrest black people who could not document employment or residence, or who were disorderly, and sentence them to forced labor on farms or road crews. These black codes also restricted black people from certain occupations, barred them from jury duty, and forbade them to possess firearms. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 in order to give the people a form of national citizenship with rights that could not be hindered by any attempts by state laws to restrict them. This caused a number of effects, such as the change of federal-state relations, the overturning of the Dred Scott decision, and because of the veto of President Johnson, the first time Congress passed major legislation despite the president's veto. When talking about the readmission of the Confederate States, there were two main constitutional questions continually brought up. The first one was, what is the Reconstruction policy? And the second one was, who should take the lead, the president or Congress? President Johnson violated the Tenure of Office Act by firing Edwin M. Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, in February 1868. The House of Representatives voted to approve the articles of impeachment. However, Johnson was not impeached because with the Senate vote of 35 to 19 to convict him, they were just one short of the majority needed. In the period of radical or congressional Reconstruction, the Military Reconstruction Acts were the first major piece of legislation. These acts divided the 10 remaining ex-Confederate states into 5 military districts that were each led by a general who made people register to vote and prevented Confederate white people that held office from uprising. If voters ratified both a new constitution that guaranteed universal manhood suffrage and the 14th Amendment, their state could be readmitted to the Union. The Reconstruction Acts filled the 3 major objectives the radical Republicans had. Firstly, they secured voting rights for the freed man. Secondly, they ensured that the southern states would be run by Republicans that enforced the new constitutions, protected former slaves' rights, and kept a Republican majority in Congress. And finally, they set standards for readmission that made the South accept the superiority of the federal government and the end of involuntary servitude, both of which were the consequences of defeat. The Southern Republicans were divided into 2 groups. Firstly, the Scalawags, who were the native white Southerners, usually farmers, merchants, and planters, that supported the Southern Republican Party during Reconstruction. And the second group were the Carpetbaggers, who were the Northerners that came to the post-Civil War South initially for economic reasons, but later became involved in Republican politics. Notice how both groups are named by the derogatory terms they called each other. The Tenure of Office Act was passed in 1867, prohibiting the president from removing office holders without the Senate's consent. Radical Republicans tended to rally under 2 main people. The first was Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, and he led the radical forces in the House of Representatives. The other was Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who rallied the radicals in the Senate. In response to President Lincoln's 10% plan, the Wade-Davis bill was passed by a group of Republicans in 1864. This bill required a majority of a state's pre-war voters to pledge loyalty to the Union, and it also demanded that the states guarantee black equality in their laws.
During Counter-Reconstruction in 1870 to 1874, racism was deepened by divisions in the South in the Republican Party. Part of this split led to white violence. Southern Democrats used their common white race to overcome differences in classes. This led to unity for the Democratic Party. Northerners started to accept Southern views like how blacks shouldn't hold office or vote. Soon, racism became acceptable, and even intellectuals started writing that whites were naturally superior. This belief heavily influenced the liberal Republicans. The use of violence. As more African Americans gained their freedom, more violence occurred. One group that formed was the Ku Klux Klan. It was founded by 6 Confederate veterans in 1866. Some were against anyone they thought had violated racial boundaries, black or white. In Georgia, a freedman was killed simply because he could read and write. The Klan used this violence for political advantages. In Louisiana, for example, 50% of the Republican vote went down after hundreds of killings. Some governors, however, did resist the Klan. In 1872, Edmund Davis in Texas got rid of the Klan completely. Other governors didn't because they thought it would alienate the white people. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1869, which guaranteed people the right to vote. Congress also passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which gave the government power to arrest people that denied citizens civil rights. The failure of Northern will. During the 1870s, American politics was corrupt. For example, in Tammany Hall, a Democratic club robbed New York City of $100 million. African Americans' rights were also a problem. Americans believed voting was a right and that blacks hadn't earned it yet. Racism was known as a natural state of affairs that no government interference can change. They also believed African Americans couldn't understand the basic principles of democracy. Similarly, immigrants were also known to be incapable of understanding American politics. After the Civil War, the economy boomed. This made government motives different. For example, the federal government denied land to freedmen, but gave millions of acres of land to corporations. These reform movements by Republicans caused the formation of groups that were concerned about the size and power of the government. Liberal Republicans in the election of 1872. Liberal Republicans proposed to reduce tariffs and end federal land grants to railroads. Soon, however, the party broke because there wasn't enough support and they allied with the Democrats. The Democratic Party elected Horace Greeley as their candidate, who lost the Republican candidate Ulysses S. Grant in 1872. Within a year, the Grant administration became corrupt, and the public opinion went down on the Republican Party. With that, the support for blacks' rights and Reconstruction also went down. Redemption for the Democrats came in 1874 to 1877 when they knew that the federal government would not work against them. Democrats saw themselves as redeemers or holy warriors who saved the South from hell of the black Republicans. Democrats turned to violence. They visited black neighborhoods after rallies to convince them not to vote. Only states with large black populations like Louisiana, South Carolina, and Mississippi survived Democrats' abuse. Elite Democrats in New Orleans organized the White League in 1874. This league challenged the state's Republican government. Much of this violence was responded with weak federal aid. For example, South Carolina asked the federal government for help against the violence, but President Grant denied help. Instead, Congress responded with the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited discrimination against black people in public theaters, parks, and trains. It also gave free blacks the right to serve on a jury. However, when blacks tested the law, many judges deemed the law unconstitutional. In the election of 1876, Democrats nominated Samuel J. Tilden and the Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes won the election, which outraged the Democrats. However, they came to a compromise. The Compromise of 1877 put Hayes in the White House and gave Democrats control of the state governments. Southern Democrats benefited most from this compromise. The memory of Reconstruction. If Democrats were ever challenged by society or questioned, they'd remind them of the horrors of Reconstruction that the Republicans caused. By the 1920s, most Americans agreed that Reconstruction brought suffering to the white South. The acceptance of this view led to no interference from the federal government. At the same time, people like John R. Lynch and W.E.B. Du Bois were writing books showing the other side of Reconstruction.
Failure of Reconstruction. By 1877, the one thing that most people could agree on is that Reconstruction had failed. The South resented the blacks and disliked when blacks practiced civil liberties like voting and their participation in politics. They did not get their 40 acres and a mule that they dreamed for to gain economic independence, but instead worked in new labor systems in Southern agriculture. Redemption caused their economic and political gains to be reversed, and they were deprived of their civil liberties. Most of African Americans lost their political strength as it had been revoked by 1877, but some of them still voted. Former slaves gained some freedom by 1877, like they still had jobs in cities and raised families peacefully and were able to enjoy religious freedom and other rights like education. Sharecropping. With political power, the blacks in the South also lost economic independence, and with black labor decreasing, the idea of sharecropping came about. To some extent, sharecropping replaced slavery. Sharecropping was a rather simple process. A landowner provided a black person with seed, land, animals, food, and housing in return for a share in their crop, usually from about half or one-third. The sharecroppers did not have any assets other than the cotton they grew, so southern states passed the cropland laws, which provided the owner the right to the crop produced next year for this year's crop. If next year's crop could not pay off this year's debt, then the person would have to work, basically as a slave, to pay off their debt. The continued low price of cotton made mobility a lesser factor during Reconstruction. The Reconstruction era provided the Constitution with the 14th and 15th Amendment, but the majority of white Southerners ignored these amendments. The Slaughterhouse Cases in 1873, which was a group of cases that decreed the 14th Amendment citizenship rights, remained under state, not federal control. In the United States versus Cruikshank in 1876, the court overturned the convictions for the Colfax Massacre, ruling that the Enforcement Act only applied to violations of blacks' rights by state, not as individuals.
The 14th and 15th Amendments impacted society by helping African Americans integrate into it through creating more social equality and providing voting rights. The legacies of the era of Reconstruction were both a large sense of failure and a more permanent freedom for former slaves, and the era itself established civil liberties protected by the Constitution as well as a reformed Southern region.